Questions orales. The honourable member from Regina Capel.
The Prime Minister's mini-budget was full of bad news for Canadians. Rent up, taxes up, prices up, and interest rates up to fight the inflation his deficits caused. In fact, Scotiabank said that their mortgage rates would be 2 full percentage points lower if the government could just control its spending. That would be the difference for hundreds of thousands of Canadians between losing their home and being able to renew their mortgage. So, does the government realize that time is running out, and will they end their deficit spending so that Canadians can keep their homes?
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the official opposition and his MPs are simply not worth the risk. He and his MPs voted against the Canada-Ukraine free trade deal. Why, Mr. Speaker? They made a brutal political calculation that they would have more support from their far-right base here in Canada and in Russia and their friends in the United States than if they would abandon Ukrainians. Cold, calculated, cruel. Behold, Mr. Speaker, the new Conservative Party and their MPs. What a disgrace.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
What's disgraceful and cruel is using Ukraine's vulnerability while Russian tanks are on its soil to shove a carbon tax permanently down their throat, Mr. Speaker. And don't be fooled by their phony outrage. They are desperate to talk about anything except for their terrible budget. That's because not only are workers' paychecks going to pay higher prices and interest rates, but now their tax dollars are going to pay higher interest payments on the national debt. In fact, next year, the government will spend more on that national debt than on healthcare and the armed forces. When will the government stop their deficits so we can pay doctors and nurses and soldiers instead of bankers and bondholders?
Before the Honourable Government House Leader gets up, I just want to encourage members to please do not extend their voices so that the Chair can hear the question from the Honourable Leader. I hear from the far end of the House. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Twice this week, the Leader of the Opposition has demonstrated that he is not worth the risk to Canadians. Not only has he been untruthful in why they didn't vote for the Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement, because in fact there is no price on pollution in that agreement, Mr. Speaker. So we need to ask, what is the real reason behind this, why they're abandoning support for Ukraine and for freedom and for democracy? But also yesterday, instead of waiting for information on what happened at Niagara Falls, he jumped straight to the conclusion that it was a terrorist attack, Mr. Speaker. That is irresponsible and that is not respectful for Canadians.
Hear, hear. The honourable member from Regina Capel.
If the government truly wanted to help Ukraine, they would support the Conservative motion to export our energy and our military equipment instead of their failed carbon tax. And if they wanted to be honest with Canadians, they would unveil the details of the $15 billion subsidy to a single battery plant that will allow up to 1,600 workers coming from Korea to replace qualified Canadians. Will they do the right thing and at least publish the agreement so that Canadian workers can find out just how many jobs are being filled by taxpayer-funded foreign replacement workers?
The Honourable Minister.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And unlike the member opposite who, when it came time to find the resolve to stand up to his leader when it was time to stand with Ukraine, Canada's support for Ukraine is unwavering. Mr. Speaker, we have committed over $2.4 billion in military aid, from tanks to armored vehicles and ammunition. We've trained 37,000 Ukrainian troops. The Prime Minister recently announced an additional $500 million in new funding for military assistance. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to Defense Minister Umerov, and I told him 10 million additional rounds of ammunition is on the way. Mr. Speaker, our government stands with Ukraine.
No, you don't. You don't stand with
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, one thing is very clear. After 8 years of this Liberal government, it's just not worth the cost. It's not helping Canadian families. The economic update shows very clearly that our public finances are in a terrible state. Earlier, I was listening to the Minister of Defense. Well, with this government, does he know that we'll spend twice as much on the debt as on the army? And twice as much on the debt as in our health transfers? That's unacceptable for a G7 country. When will this government realize that it's messed everything up over the last 8 years?
L'honorable ministre de l'Innovation.
The Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that the Conservatives voted against Ukraine. They voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. When it comes to the economy, we're doing what Canadians want. We will continue to build a stronger economy. We will strengthen competition in the country. We will continue to invest in housing. We have a plan for prosperity, growth. We will help Canadians. And the Conservatives should watch what we're doing and draw inspiration from our serious government. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, 2 million Canadians are going to food banks monthly because of what this government did. People who want to buy a home now see that the cost of rents and mortgages has doubled over the last 8 years, and so have deposits. And what does the Minister of Finance plan to do? Believe it or not, she plans to borrow over a century. Our great-great-grandchildren will be paying the price. Does the Prime Minister agree with the Deputy Prime Minister? Does he really think that this is a good idea?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I have a great deal of respect for my colleague, for Louis Saint Laurent. He's an honourable man. On his side of the House, he should convince his colleagues to do one thing before the holidays for Canadians. Vote for Bill C-56, a bill that will help Canadians with affordability, that will reform the Competition Act after 36 years. I know that he has influence in his party. Will he be strong enough to stand up and influence his colleagues to do one thing for Canadians before Christmas this year? The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, in its economic update, the federal government is butting into Quebec's labour jurisdiction. It wants to impose policies on interprovincial labour mobility, especially in the area of health, or it will cut health transfers. But in Quebec, healthcare is offered in French. So this plan means that Quebec workers who are bilingual will be able to go work elsewhere in Canada, but then workers will come to Quebec from unilingual Anglophone provinces, and they won't speak French. In Quebec, people need to speak French in healthcare. So instead of making healthcare worse in Quebec, why doesn't the federal government butt out? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I greatly respect my colleague from the Bloc Québécois, but he's completely wrong on this issue. We transfer $700 million a year to Quebec for immigration, and most of that money is used for what? To francisize people arriving in Quebec, including Anglophones who want to learn French. We will be there for labour mobility. We will be there to train people in the language of their choice. We will be collaborating with Quebec every single day. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, it's here clearly laid out. This government is threatening to cut the healthcare transfers if we refuse to exchange our francophone healthcare workers, to exchange them for unilingual Anglophone doctors. We don't need them in Quebec. We need doctors who can offer healthcare in French. Quebecers need to be able to tell their doctors about their health problems in their own language. If the federal government wants to help, it just has to increase the transfers and we will hire doctors. Will this government finally stop taking Quebecers' money and then use it to blackmail Quebecers? Enough is enough. The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, we know what the Bloc Québécois wants. It wants every province to just deal with its own stuff. It wants Quebec to be isolated on its own. That's not the way it should be. We are capable of cooperating. We're capable of exchanging doctors. We're capable of working together. Canada is much stronger than the sum of its provinces. We can work together. The Bloc Québécois doesn't like it, but that's the truth.
L'honorable député de Rosemont.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago, the Minister of Industry was begging grocery bosses to lower prices. He said, please, be nice. And then he said, we succeeded. Look, there are specials at the grocery store. But during an interview with TVA, the CEO of Metro said, we have not changed our prices because of that meeting. Since the meeting, nothing has changed. In fact, the only special was on turkey because it was Thanksgiving. So who's the real turkey here? Is it consumers who are paying high prices, or is it the Minister of Industry? The Honourable Minister of Industry. Mr. Speaker, I am not going to engage in this type of rhetorical device, but what I will do is stand up for Canadians. And that's what I did. For the first time in history, a minister brought in these industry bosses and told them that 40 million Canadians are extremely upset with these higher prices, and they need to help us stabilize these prices. So if my colleague wants to do anything for Canadians and give them a Christmas gift, then my colleague should convince his colleagues to vote for C-56 so that we can stabilize prices and increase competitiveness and fight for Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cowichan Malahat Langford.
You know, I almost feel a little bit sorry for the minister. He made such a big deal out of his meeting with the grocery CEOs, and now Metro has admitted that it had zero impact on food prices. And Mr. Speaker, any Canadian who's been watching food prices soar could have told the Liberal government that. Instead of standing up to CEOs, the minister has danced around price gouging for 2 years. The Liberal plan isn't working. With the holidays coming, prices are only going to get worse. So will the government support the NDP's bill to lower food prices and end the gouging?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Speaker, I find it shocking that an honourable colleague would not stand with the government where we're standing up for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. I remember an NDP party, Mr. Speaker, that would stand for consumer, that would stand for Canadian, that would stand for our country, Mr. Speaker. I enjoy the member, instead of criticizing, join us, Mr. Speaker. Fight for Canadian, express the outrage of millions of Canadians. That's what we did, Mr. Speaker. That's what we will continue to do. And I hope he's going to vote for C-56 to make sure that we have more competition in this country.
Before I proceed to the member from Calgary Forest Lawn, I just want to ask the member from Brantford, please to only use his voice when he does take his time. The honourable member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
This week's Liberal NDP inflation fueling false hopes update is not worth the cost. Prices are up, rents are up, debt is up, taxes are up, and after 8 years, time's up for this Prime Minister. $20 billion of new inflationary spending is ballooning the debt. Next year, the Prime Minister will spend more tax dollars on the interest to his debt than on health transfers. Wow. Why is this Prime Minister giving more money to bankers and bondholders while Canadians go broke and hungry?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for his question because it gives me an opportunity to let him know what's up. What's up in this country is home construction, Mr. Speaker. Our fall economic statement has indicated that we are building more homes from coast to coast to coast right across this great country because that's what Canadians need right now, Mr. Speaker. It also contains important measures that will strengthen competition in this country and help stabilize prices. What's down, Mr. Speaker, is inflation in Canada. Thank you.
The honourable member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
She wants to talk about housing. The only thing they did for housing was change the name of the housing department. And Canadians want results. They don't want more photo ops. Rents are up. Mortgages are up. Needed down payment for a house is doubled after 8 years. This Liberal NDP government are not worth the cost. When will they stop the photo ops and build more homes and not more bureaucracy?
Good job. The Honourable Minister for Housing, Communities and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, it's fascinating. It's clear the honourable member hasn't actually read the document when he seems to have missed $15 billion in low-cost loans that's going to get Canada building. He missed a $1 billion investment to keep affordable housing going. He missed the fact that we're cracking down on short-term rentals to release tens of thousands of homes to increase supply. When I actually look at their plan, Mr. Speaker, they want to raise taxes on home builders by putting the GST back on. They want to cut funding for cities that build homes through the Housing Accelerator Fund, and they want to add layers of bureaucracy to do it. We're going to do what it takes to get more homes built. I invite the Conservatives to join us.
The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, everything's up. Mortgages are up, rent payments are up, inflation is up, groceries are up, taxes are up. And yet, the Bank of Canada has asked for help in keeping inflation down. They've asked for governments to limit their spending growth to 2.5% each year. Except guess what this government just announced? An increase in growth of spending of over 5% for next year. Is the minister trying to make misery go up for Canadians too?
Yes, he is.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I can hardly believe that the Conservatives are talking about taxes. We reduced taxes for middle-class Canadians on 2 occasions, Mr. Speaker, and the entire Conservative caucus, every single Conservative member, voted against lowering taxes for the Canadians that needed it most, Mr. Speaker. The fall economic statement that we put forward this week shows the strong fundamentals of our fiscal frame, Mr. Speaker. We have the lowest deficit among all G7 countries, and we will have the highest growth in 2024 among all G7 countries, Mr. Speaker. We are proud of our record. We are continuing to be there for Canadians. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, this government's record is inflationary deficits driving up the cost of living. In fact, 1 year ago, the finance minister stood in the House and presented a plan that would balance the budget in 2027. When asked whether that was by mistake or by design, the minister took great boastfulness in saying it was deliberate and by design. Except now we learn the budget will be balanced in the year never. So does the government actually have a plan to ever balance the budget and bring down inflationary deficits so Canadians can keep their homes?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, you know what's up, Mr. Speaker? It's our ranking in the world, Mr. Speaker. You know what's up is the number of jobs that we've created in this country. You know what's up, Mr. Speaker, is the prosperity in this country. Mr. Speaker, we rank 3rd in the world now for foreign direct investment, Mr. Speaker. We have seen landmark investment in the auto sector, in the mining sector, in biomanufacturing, in steel, in aluminium, Mr. Speaker. Canada's winning on the world stage while the Conservative want to bring us to the Stone Age.
The Honourable Member from Lethbridge.
Well, after 8 years of this Liberal government, we know that prices are up, rent is up, we know that mortgage rates are up and taxes are up, and we know that Canadians are fed up with this current government. Just this week, this government chose to spend an additional $20 billion, which goes towards our overall national debt load, which means that now, just interest, will cost Canadians $51 billion per year. Imagine that. That's enough to build 25 new hospitals and a whole host of new doctors. Imagine the difference that would make for Canadians. So why is the Prime Minister choosing to support wealthy bankers instead of the healthcare needs of Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, when we unveiled our plan to build more homes across this country faster, the Conservative leader called that disgusting. When the Conservatives talk about the spending that they would cut, they're talking about removing supports that Canadians need. They're talking about taking away the benefits that Canadians rely on, benefits for seniors, benefits for family, benefits for people who need it most, Mr. Speaker. The plan of austerity that the Conservatives are proposing is not worth the risk.
Yep, chop, chop, chop.
The Honourable Member from Lethbridge.
The member didn't respond to my question, so perhaps she didn't understand it. I'll put it forward again. $51 billion is spent every single year just on interest towards our national debt. $51 billion. That's enough to build more than 25 brand new hospitals and a whole host of new doctors. It's twice as much as what this government is willing to spend on our national defense. The men and women who wear a uniform and protect our front lines. Yes. Are they not worth more than the out-of-control spending spree that this government selfishly takes upon itself?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister for Health.
Well, here's the inconvenient truth, Mr. Speaker, that in order for the party opposite to do what they're talking about, that they would have to cut massively into every aspect of the federal government. And so I asked him, she talks about healthcare, where we're making historic investments right now to ensure that the healthcare system is public and there for Canadians. And when we heard about common sense Conservatives in Ontario, we saw a direct attack against public healthcare. So will they cut dental care? Will they cut the transfers? Will they cut the critical supports that are there in healthcare and promotion? Exactly what kind of cuts are they going to do?
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, asylum requests are a federal responsibility, and that's why Quebec wants to be reimbursed for the services we offer asylum seekers, like housing and social services, but the federal government is refusing to pay. The immigration minister said yesterday that we don't just have $400 million lying around. Well, first of all, it's actually $460 million. But also, Quebec actually did manage to find that money in order to help asylum seekers. And so the minister is going to have to find it too, somewhere. Will he pay back Quebec for these services? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This relationship is a two-way street. We received the letter. And yes, this is an area of shared jurisdiction, actually. It's shared with the Quebec and the provinces and territories. We sent $600 million to Quebec under the Quebec-Canada Agreement. This is a fund that grows year after year, and Quebec needs to take on its own responsibility. We are ready to sit down to negotiate about it with our respective finance ministers. The Honourable Member. Well, in the Constitution, asylum requests are federal jurisdiction. And then in addition, this government is not just not paying, it's also not offering services. It's always the same thing with these Liberals. They say they defend asylum seekers, but actually they only want to make a bunch of pretty speeches. But when the rubber hits the road, they're not there to help. No services, no money. Quebec is giving asylum seekers the services they need. Will the federal government do its one job, which is to pay back Quebec? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Well, I am not going to take lessons on the Constitution from the Bloc Québécois, Mr. Speaker. Last year, we gave Quebec $700 million under the Canada-Quebec Agreement. We gave them more money this year. In fact, we even gave them more, and we didn't ask them to pay it back. I'm only asking for a reasonable discussion between our respective finance ministers. Let's sit down, let's negotiate, and let's have a mature discussion. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Well, speaking of mature discussions, let me quote the Quebec Minister for Canadian Relations, who said that the federal government policy is, we decide, you pay. Yes, I will boast that we are the most generous country in the world. We'll take all the world's problems here, but Quebecers will pay. No, that makes no sense and is not a responsible policy. That was the Quebec minister speaking. Yes, Quebec is welcoming and generous towards asylum seekers. It just needs the money to keep on being generous. When will the federal government finally pay Quebec back? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Same question, same answer, Mr. Speaker. In addition to the social transfers, which are sent out to all of the provinces as a flat payment, we are offering more and more money to Quebec every year under the Canada-Quebec Agreement. Regardless of levels, Quebec has its role to play in welcoming immigrants and asylum seekers. We are ready to sit down with Quebec and have a mature discussion between two accountable governments.
From Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek.
After 8 years of this Prime Minister, life has never been so unaffordable. While Canadians struggle, he's quadrupling his carbon tax, which will raise the price of everything. He's just not worth the cost. The Liberal NDP government can pass Conservative Bill C-234, create another carbon tax carve-out for farmers, and make food cheaper. His Environment Minister has threatened to resign if it passes. Will the Prime Minister accept his resignation, pass C-234, so Canadians can put food on their tables?
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, in this House, Conservatives had a choice. They had a choice to vote in favour of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. Instead, they're the only party in this House that didn't do that. In fact, they have made the issue of the environment a red herring. Even Ukraine today clarified that there is no price on pollution in this free trade agreement. They're misleading Canadians. On this side of the House, we are standing, supporting Ukraine. We will continue to do that. The Conservatives cannot say the same.
The Honourable Member from Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek.
After 8 years of their failed carbon tax, food bank lineups are longer than they've ever been, and Canadians are going hungry. And now they want to oppose this Liberal carbon tax on Ukraine. The Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Conservative Bill C-234 will deliver lower food prices for Canadians by removing the carbon tax on our farmers. Ministers are panicking and begging senators to block it. Will the Prime Minister tell his ministers to back off, put Canadians first, and let his appointed senators pass C-234 so Canadian families can feed themselves?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's unfortunate because I don't think the member opposite was listening to the previous question. In fact, today, Ukraine said there is no price on pollution in the agreement. So it continues to be an absolute red herring and mistruth from the members opposite as to why they're not supporting the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Speaker, it's another demonstration of how irresponsible, how reckless, and how risky it would be for them to be in power because they simply cannot share the true reasonings behind their decisions with Canadians. They just can't be trusted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Beauce.
Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Beauce. Well, Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this government doesn't seem to get that it could reduce food prices very easily. We understand. We brought forward a common-sense bill, C-234, which would exempt farmers from the carbon tax. But the costly Bloc Liberal coalition wants to radically increase the tax. If you vote for the Bloc, you'll pay a steep price. Will this Liberal government stop delaying the adoption of the bill in the Senate? When will the Prime Minister let his senators adopt Bill C-234 so farmers can feed Canadians? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, do you know what raises food prices? Climate change. Drought, floods. And yet, the Conservatives never even mention climate change. They don't even seem capable of spelling the concept. They seem to want to drag us back into a former era on climate change, but we won't listen to them. We're going to do something about the problem.
The honourable member from Vancouver East.
Canadians from coast to coast need affordable homes today. People are living in tent encampments, being evicted from their homes, or trapped paying sky-high rent. And the Liberals continue to delay and disappoint. In their fall economic statement, by delaying funding until 2025 means affordable homes won't be built for at least another 7 years. This is absurd and completely out of touch. Will this Prime Minister commit to roll out the money now so that shovels can get into the ground and build the homes that Canadians desperately need?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for her question and for concern to continue to support people in need of housing urgently. I'm pleased to share with her that there are existing programs that have money that continue to support the construction of new homes, both in the market and for affordable housing for low-income families. What we've done in the fall economic statement is demonstrate our long-term commitment so people who are making decisions to go ahead with projects will apply for their building permits now, will get their designs done now, and I'm pleased to share that the Cooperative Housing Federation indicated the statement shows action from the federal government to support more non-market and affordable housing. They were pleased with the new investments, including $1 billion in affordable housing for co-op, non-profit, and social housing.
The honourable member from Winnipeg Centre.
Her Parliament unanimously supported my motion recognizing missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people as a Canada-wide emergency. But how many times is MMIWG mentioned in the Liberals' fall economic statement? Zero. And earlier this year, the government slashed $150 million from women's shelters. Major municipalities have called gender-based violence an epidemic. So can the government explain why they're ignoring MMIWG and are slashing money from women's shelters?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her ongoing advocacy on this issue. Addressing the ongoing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people is a whole-of-government approach which requires living up to our moral obligations as a country and the calls for justice. That's why in Budget 2023, we've invested $125 million to implement the National Action Plan for MMIWG to ensure accountability by establishing an oversight mechanism and support the National Family and Survivor Circle. We will continue to work with families to ensure we address the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member from Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the Conservative Party under this leader does not support Ukraine. This leader has not advocated for more military, financial, or humanitarian support for Ukraine. He's not called out Russia's acts of genocide, and this week, that leader and every MP in his caucus voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. The Conservatives are trying to blame their decision on a mention of carbon.
So, I'm going to ask the honourable member if he could quickly, in the 12 seconds that order. The honourable member has about 12 seconds left on the clock. I'm hoping the member can get to the issue of business of the government.
Conservative members are trying to blame their vote against the agreement by trying to blame it on language about carbon pricing, which is a red herring because Ukraine's had carbon pricing since 2011 and they need it to get into the EU. Could the Minister of International Trade share with Canadians why this agreement is so important to Canada?
Once again, members know that the speakership had issued a ruling in terms of having questions which are relevant either to the business of the government or to business of committees that could be posed to committee chairs or to members of the Board of Internal Economy. I'm moving on to the next question, the honourable member from South Shore St. Margaret's.
But to allow 1,600 taxpayer-funded foreign replacement workers come to Canada to work at the new battery plant in Windsor. The $15 billion taxpayer subsidy means that each family in Canada is paying $1,000 to subsidize these foreign replacement workers. After 8 years, this Prime Minister's not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister release the contract to prove taxpayer-funded foreign replacement workers are banned?
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the question by the Honourable Member from Etobicoke Centre. I thank him for his advocacy. I was proud to join with him to vote in favour of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. President Zelensky wanted this agreement. This is an important agreement.
Order. The question was posed by the member from South Shore St. Margaret's. I'm certain the Honourable Minister is going to get to the point to respond to the question at hand. The Honourable Member has 18 seconds left on the clock.
I'm proud on this side of the House that we voted in favour of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. Canadian businesses have asked for it. They want to be a part of rebuilding Ukraine. On this side of the House, we are supporting Ukraine. And I'm disappointed, Mr.
Order! The Honourable Minister, I cannot, it is impossible, as I'm having members raise their voices directly into the Speaker's ear, to hear the response, to judge whether or not the response is doing with the issue of questions. So I'm going to ask the Honourable Minister again, 15 seconds on the clock. I'm going to ask Honourable members to listen closely to the answer to the question that was posed by the member from South Shore St. Margaret's. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're supporting Ukraine. Canadian businesses have asked for this agreement because they want to be a part of rebuilding Ukraine. I'm disappointed, but I am not surprised that the Conservatives have decided to abandon Ukraine. You know, Mr. Speaker, when someone shows you who they are.
The Honourable Member from South Shore St. Margaret's.
From the top?
It's your second question.
They didn't answer my first question. Apparently, they're afraid of the fact that they've decided to bring in foreign replacement workers to Stellantis, and the ministers are ignoring it. And why are they ignoring it? Because on the government's own website, they're advertising for Stellantis jobs that say you don't need to be a Canadian citizen and you don't even need a work permit. And the ambassador for South Korea informed everyone in Windsor that 1,600 replacement workers from South Korea are coming. Wow. So I'll ask again, since this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, if the Prime Minister in this government disputes those facts, release the contract and prove us wrong.
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it's obvious for Canadians watching at home how much the Conservatives don't want to talk about Ukraine, Mr. Speaker. But one thing I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it is amazing to see to which extent the Conservatives would go to spread misinformation, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? Sometimes you get caught, Mr. Speaker. Let me quote Brendan Sweeney of the Trillion Network for Advanced Manufacturing. I think that those making this noise are hypocritical. What they are saying is erroneous and factually incorrect. They don't have the faintest knowledge of the industry, Mr. Speaker. We'll keep on fighting for Windsor. We'll keep on fighting for the auto sector, and we'll keep on fighting for our workers.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lilley, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup.
Oh, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has awarded a $15 billion contract to finance a battery plant in Windsor with public funds. The problem, though, is that the workers will come from abroad, not from Canada. Specifically, 1,600 temporary workers will come from abroad. Quebecers are wondering whether local jobs are being protected for the Northvolt plant in Quebec, which is being financed to the tune of $5 billion by taxpayers. Did the Prime Minister guarantee jobs for Quebecers when he gave Northvolt this money? Or is he bringing in even more taxpayer-funded foreign replacement workers? The Honourable Industry Minister. Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for giving me the opportunity to talk about this once again. Canada is now third in the world, third when it comes to attracting foreign investment in our country. Mr. Speaker, we have made record investments in the auto industry, and we also have investments in mining and in biomanufacturing, as well as in aluminum and steel. Mr. Speaker, if there's one thing that's very clear, it's that we have a plan for prosperity. We have a plan for Canada. We have a plan for growth, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lilley, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, if what we're saying is misinformation, as the Liberals claim, then they should explain why the government is posting jobs for candidates who are bilingual in English and Korean. My information comes directly from the Windsor Police. The Windsor Police received a visit from the South Korean ambassador to organize the arrival of 1,600 Korean workers, Mr. Speaker. So after 8 years of this government, can they for once be transparent and make this contract public? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, Conservatives don't like to let facts interrupt what they want to say. As for Stellantis, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are trying to hinder the 2,500 jobs for Canadians at that battery plant, as well as the 2,300 jobs for those who will build the plant. How many foreign workers have been approved for Stellantis Nexstar? One temporary foreign worker. Only one. The Honourable Member for Avignon-La-Métis, Matane-Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, COP28 kicks off next Thursday, and Canada is once again poised to show up empty-handed. Canada will go to COP28 without a regulatory framework to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector, which is the main culprit behind climate change. We've been waiting 2 years for this, and for 2 years we've been hearing empty rhetoric. Today, the Climate Action Network was on the Hill. All of the Environment Minister's former friends, like Greenpeace and Équiterre, are calling on him to table a costed regulatory framework before he leaves for COP. And of course, the Bloc Québécois supports this call. So will the minister do this? The Honourable Environment and Climate Change Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for her question. I would like to reassure my colleague that they are my former colleagues, but they are still my friends. Yes, they were here on the Hill today. I speak to them regularly. And over the past few years, we have taken a lot of action. We've implemented many measures for carbon pricing and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as the Prime Minister committed to do in New York, by the end of the year, we will have a framework to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. So that will be done before the end of the year. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. The International Energy Agency this morning tabled a report on emissions from the oil and gas sector. If we want to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, we need to cut fossil fuel emissions by 60% by 2030. That's around the corner. We need to cut emissions by 60%, but Canada doesn't even have a plan yet to even cap them, let alone cut them by 60%. Canada is the world's 5th biggest oil producer, and Canada will be one of the main culprits if the world misses its targets. So, before the minister leaves for COP28, will he present a regulatory framework to, at the very least, cap big oil companies' emissions? The Honourable Environment and Climate Change Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In addition to what I just said, I would like to remind my honourable colleague that we have a plan to fight climate change, and our plan is lauded by Équiterre, by Greenpeace, by Environmental Defence, by the David Suzuki Foundation, too. We are the only country of all G20 countries to have stopped subsidizing fossil fuels, and we did so 2 years earlier than anticipated. We're also the only G20 country to eliminate public support for fossil fuels. And as I said, we will be tabling a framework to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector by the end of this year.
From Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Yesterday, the NDP Liberal Cover-Up Coalition blocked a Conservative motion to have a whistleblower testify at the Ethics Committee. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, it's hard not to feel disappointed in your government when every day there's a new scandal, but it's easy to see that this Prime Minister is not worth the price. The latest scandal is his billion-dollar green slush fund. Facing an Auditor General investigation, an Ethics Commissioner investigation, the CEO and the Liberal hand-picked board chair resigned in disgrace. Now they're blocking a whistleblower from testifying. What are they trying to hide?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for the question from my colleague. In fact, nothing, Mr. Speaker, because we're the one who wants to get to the bottom of this, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. Let me bring some facts to their story. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the moment we had delegation, I called for an investigation. I called for an independent report, Mr. Speaker. I demanded from management a plan to restore good governance. The CEO has resigned. I have accepted the resignation of the chair, Mr. Speaker. We're going to get to the bottom of this, restore governance, and make sure we can support Canadian businesses.
The Honourable Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Island and Rideau Lakes.
This minister is a bystander in this billion-dollar slush fund scandal. Let's lay out the facts. He did absolutely nothing. Conservatives called for an investigation at committee. We wrote a letter to the Auditor General. She started an investigation. We wrote a letter to the Ethics Commissioner. He launched an investigation. We had the CEO and the board chair come to committee. They both resigned in disgrace following their appearances at committee. Right. Now we want a whistleblower to come before committee, and what are they doing? Silencing whistleblowers as part of the cover-up coalition with the NDP. What are they trying to hide?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, unlike my colleague, they're just behind the game, Mr. Speaker, because I'm the one who started the investigation, Mr. Speaker. Once we got the allegation, that's what we did, Mr. Speaker. The record speaks for itself, Mr. Speaker. But I know that my Conservative friends, they want nothing regarding to facts, Mr. Speaker. They like to have their theory, they like to have their story, but they're not entitled to their own facts, Mr. Speaker. We're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to restore governance, and we're going to keep helping Canadian SMEs, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Battle River Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, while Conservatives are working overtime to expose Liberal corruption, Liberal and NDP backbenchers and even a former minister are doing everything they can at committee to cover up scandals, silence whistleblowers and shut down investigations. Can the Prime Minister tell us whether the coalition deal he signed behind closed doors with the Socialist NDP includes requiring the NDP member from Hamilton Centre to vote to cover up the corruption we are seeing with the Prime Minister's billion-dollar green slush fund?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what we're seeing is a pattern of very concerning behavior and desperate behavior from the Conservative Party of Canada. Not only are they hiding from Canadians why they're really not supporting the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, because in fact the Ukraine came out and said there is no price on pollution. They're also hiding the leader of the opposition, why he won't tell the truth as to why he jumped to conclusions yesterday when we learned about what happened in Niagara Falls. And now what we're hearing from them, Mr. Speaker, is false allegations. They know that committees are independent. What are they trying to hide, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be about C-57. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has cost thousands of lives and continues to threaten the stability of the whole region and of the world. This, though unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition and Conservative MPs voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. And this is a free trade agreement that the President of Ukraine said very clearly would serve as a foundation for rebuilding Ukraine. The Conservatives turned their back on Ukraine and on democracy, all for rhetoric. So here's my question for the Minister of Finance. Can she reiterate Canada's strong, unconditional support? The Minister of Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, currently, Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom and for ours. They are fighting for it on the battlefields in Ukraine. We've all seen this. I saw them in Ukraine. They are strong, they are brave, and they are ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. They came to us. They sought us out and asked us to negotiate a free trade agreement. We are the first G7 country to reach a free trade agreement with them. To vote against this agreement, as the Conservatives are doing, is to let Ukrainians down and to, in fact, support Russia.
Grant.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister has done nothing but recklessly spend. Not only was $54 million rushed into the poorly functioning Arrive scam app, but 11 million taxpayer dollars given to a so-called consulting company employing 2 people working out of their basements doing absolutely no work. Talk about hitting the taxpayer lottery. It is beyond clear that the NDP Liberal government is simply not worth the cost. The question is simple. Which minister was responsible for this costly hiring?
The Honourable Minister.
I don't want to disappoint my colleague across the aisle, but no minister was responsible for those contracting practices. Those contracting practices were done by public servants. And Mr. Speaker, we have said if committees want to look into these issues, we welcome that examination. The Border Services Agency, when they uncovered irregularities, called for an independent audit and referred the files to the appropriate authorities. That's what a responsible government does, in spite of some of the silly questions from the other side.
The Honourable Member from Brantford Brant.
Canadians want these questions asked of this ethically and morally challenged government. Public officials were caught lying. Insiders who became millionaires through the Arrive scam were caught lying. It's time for honesty and clarity in this House. For weeks we've heard the same talking points from this minister. No action. No one's been charged. No one's been fired. So once again, will the minister responsible for this fiasco that the RCMP is investigating please stand up?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend knows very well that when any irregularity with respect to contracting practices comes to light, the responsible thing for senior public servants who administer these rules to do is to refer them to the appropriate authorities, to establish the facts from external audits. That's exactly what the Border Services Agency did. Mr. Speaker, if committees want to look into this matter, we welcome that exercise as well. And my honourable friend should know very well that it's not elected ministers that decide who faces criminal charges. It's the police and prosecutors, and I have every confidence they'll do their job.
Absolutely. The Honourable Member from Calgary Confederation.
Mr. Speaker, a couple of years ago, this House unanimously passed my private member's bill that allowed for the annual tax form to be used to ask a simple question of organ and tissue donation. Both Ontario and Nunavut opted to have this question included in their tax forms last year, and I'm hoping that other provinces will participate in the future. Can the Minister tell us how many taxpayers in Ontario and Nunavut indicated through their tax return their intent to become a life-saving organ and tissue donor?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Confederation has worked hard to help Canadians waiting for a transplant. I was happy to support his bill along with members from all parties. It shows we can do great things when we work together. The impact of this change is significant, and I'm pleased to tell you it has been very successful already. The most recent numbers we have indicate that 2.45 million people used their tax return to indicate they want to be a donor. This is very promising. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Mississauga East Cooksville.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of International Trade regarding the important Canada-Ukraine trade agreement and Conservatives' concerns of our government's unequivocal support for Ukraine. They were right about one thing, Mr. Speaker. Support for Ukraine on this side of the House is unequivocal. Clearly, the same cannot be said for the Conservative Party of Canada. Speaker, did the Conservatives make this shameful decision to appease their far-right, anti-Ukraine extreme base? Can the minister tell us what the Ukrainians, our friends, have said about this agreement?
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from Mississauga East Cookville for that really excellent question. President Zelensky himself asked for Canada to negotiate a progressive, strong, excellent free trade agreement. We've modernized it and we've done that. The only party in this House that voted against Ukraine is the Conservative Party of Canada. I want to say that on this side of the House, we stand with Ukraine in what we say, in what we do, and certainly in how we vote. This side has voted for Ukraine.
The honourable member from Churchill-Kiwatanuk-Aski.
Mr. Speaker, we now have an accurate picture of the infrastructure gap facing First Nations, and the numbers are truly vile. $350 billion. This is First Nations like Shamattawa facing a housing crisis. It's the long-term boil water advisory in Pucketawagan and 27 other First Nations. It's crumbling schools like the one in Tatasquiac Cree Nation. It's the forced isolation of communities like Wasagamak and Pungasi who desperately need an airport. It's unacceptable, but what's this government's solution? Cuts to Indigenous services. Why are the Liberals punishing First Nations for Liberal failures?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for that very important question, and I really appreciate her passion in this matter. I'm proud to be part of a government that's done more than any other to close the infrastructure gap, and we're investing and working with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to build healthy, resilient, and prosperous communities for the long term. That's why we're supporting over 9,000 infrastructure projects, including the Indigenous-led Waterway Power, which is connecting 17 diesel-independent First Nations communities to the Ontario power grid. We're going to continue following Indigenous leadership to address the infrastructure priorities from coast to coast to coast. We know there's more work that needs to be done. We're committed to building this work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners.
The honourable member from Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, while a 4-day pause is delayed by a day, Israel has only intensified its bombing of the Gaza Strip. For 6 weeks now, this government has been unequivocal in demanding hostages be returned, as they should. Yet they can't even seem to bring themselves to say the word ceasefire. An estimated 5,500 children have now died in the Gaza Strip alone in recent weeks. And so I ask again, how many children need to die until this government's going to call for a ceasefire?
The Honourable Minister for Global Affairs.
Of course, we condemn the October 7 terrorist attack by Hamas. And of course, we're extremely preoccupied with what is happening in Gaza. I've said it many times. This is one of the worst places, if not the worst place, to live in the world, and too many women and children have died. And that's why we welcome the humanitarian pause that will be happening starting tomorrow, that has been agreed between Israel and Hamas and brokered by Qatar. And of course, we'll continue to support the fact that Canadians need to get out of Gaza, civilians must be protected, humanitarian aid must go in, and hostages need to be released.
Good job.
And that brings us to the end of question period. I would like to bring to members' attention the presence in the gallery of the Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council of Canada's 2023 Impact Award winners.